In the heart of London, where the River Thames coiled like a silver snake around the ambitions of men, there lived a king in waiting whose life was a contradiction. He was Henry of Monmouth, Prince of Wales, and heir apparent to the shaky throne of England. To the common folk, he was merely Prince Hal, a figure of infamous notoriety, a frequenter of taverns in the disreputable Eastcheap district, carousing with highwaymen and rogues like the enormous charismatic Falstaff. This was not the image of a future sovereign. It was a scandal, a political embarrassment to his father, King Henry IV, a monarch who had seized the crown in a bloody coup, forever haunted by the shadow of regicide. The king, gaunt and perpetually ill, watched his son's antics with despair, convinced Hal cared more for wine and low company than the weight of the imperium. What the king and most of his court failed to grasp was the depth of the prince's education and the strategic nature of his misspent youth. Henry was no fool. He was fluent in French and Latin, a scholar of both military tactics and theological debate. His taverns were not just dens of vice, they were listening posts, places where the pulse of the common people could be felt, where loyalty was bought with laughter and a pint of ale rather than gold or titles. His reputation, in a strange, subversive way, shielded him. By being the wild prince, he was underestimated by his enemies at home and abroad. The year was 1413. On a cold, late March morning, King Henry IV finally succumbed to his protracted illness. The scene was one of fraught Shakespearean drama. The dying king had famously demanded to know if the crown was safe, only to be answered by the newly reformed Prince Hal, "I placed it on my head, my liege. I shall keep it there." At 25, Henry V was King of England. The transition was instant and absolute. The tavern doors slammed shut, the dissolute companions were dismissed with pensions, a final severance from the past. A man who had seemingly mastered only revelry now revealed himself to be a statesman of astonishing clarity and focus. His first act was one of deliberate political genius. He had the body of the deposed Richard II, whose murder had stained his father's reign, reburied with solemn royal honors. The act was a declaration, a cleansing of the past, a stabilization of the present, and an affirmation that Henry V was a king whose legitimacy rested on God's will, not man's maneuvering. But stability was an illusion. The exchequer was near bankrupt. The kingdom was still fractured by the feuds of powerful nobles. And across the narrow, choppy waters of the English Channel lay the true prize, France. Second, the gauntlet throne, claim and conspiracy. The English claim to the French throne was a legacy issue, tracing back centuries, yet Henry V chose to press it with immediate, stunning audacity. He dispatched ambassadors to the court of the perpetually insane King Charles VI of France, demanding not just a few traditional French holdings, but the crown itself. The French Dauphin, Prince Charles, dismissed Henry's demand with an infamous mocking gift, a chest of tennis balls. The implication was clear. The English king was a juvenile playboy, fit only for games, not for the serious business of war. The casus belli was secured. For Henry, the insult was a public challenge, a perfect rhetorical tool to galvanize a nation and raise the necessary war funds. He framed the conflict not as a grab for land, but as a divine mission to reclaim his rightful inheritance, which God himself would sanction. The preparations for the invasion were meticulous and unprecedented. Henry V was an administrator as much as a warrior. He personally oversaw the building of ships, the organization of supply lines, and the training of a new kind of army.
Unlike his predecessors, he focused on the deadly potential of the English longbowman. Each archer, a master craftsman with a deadly weapon, could lose 10 arrows a minute, transforming a peasant farmer into a force multiplier on the battlefield. As the king stood poised to cross the channel, a chilling intimacy emerged: the Southampton Plot. A conspiracy led by 3 high-ranking noblemen, including Richard, Earl of Cambridge, aimed to assassinate Henry and replace him with a distant cousin, Edmund Mortimer, before the fleet could even sail. The plot was discovered at the last minute. The 3 men were arrested, tried, and summarily executed. The act demonstrated Henry's terrifying resolve. He was a king who would not hesitate. Treason was met with swift, unsparing justice, proving to his assembled forces that the only loyalty they needed was to him. With the internal threat purged, on August 11, 1415, the king and his army embarked for France.
End the war in one stroke. For weeks, the English army was shadowed by French scouts. Their only hope of crossing the major rivers, the Somme and the Tournoise, was continually frustrated by French forces guarding every viable bridge and ford. Henry was forced further and further inland, his supply lines stretched, his men losing hope. At one point, the army was forced to march south, away from Calais, in a desperate search for a crossing. It was a moment of true peril where Henry's leadership shone brightest. He held daily masses, personally oversaw the sick, and spoke to his troops not of victory, but of endurance and faith. His soldiers, cold, hungry, and sick, began to see him not as a distant king, but as a resolute companion in suffering. Finally, after a perilous flanking maneuver, Henry found an undefended ford on the Somme and managed to cross the river. The trap was sprung, but the French had been wrong-footed. Henry turned his army north, putting a smaller river, the Tournoise, and the vast, muddy fields of northern France between his exhausted men and the pursuing French juggernaut. On October 24, 1415, near the village of Azincourt, which the English would pronounce as Agincourt, the English army finally came to face with the French host. Agincourt, the day of the longbow. The night before the battle was a study in contrasts. The French camp, enormous and supremely confident, was a cacophony of noise, drunken revelry, boastful challenges, and the clatter of weapons being polished for the easy win they expected on the morrow. The English camp, huddled between 2 thick woods, was silent. Henry ordered the priests to hold confessions, knowing that many would not see the sunrise. He walked among his men, a cloak pulled tight against the freezing rain, his face grim but resolute. He forbade any talk of surrender or rescue. He was one of them, a man facing overwhelming odds, relying only on God and the courage of his fellow Englishmen. The morning of October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, dawned cold, damp, and muddy. The French army, numbering perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 men, was arrayed across the field, their noblemen encased in gleaming heavy plate armor. The English, a mere 6,000, stood opposite, their longbowmen protected only by leather jackets, their only defense the forest on either flank, and their king's brilliant tactical placement. Henry V had chosen his battlefield perfectly. The open ground between the 2 woods was only 1,000 yards wide. This narrowed choke point prevented the massive French army from using its superior numbers to envelop the English flanks. The overnight rain had churned the newly plowed field into a thick, clinging mud, a treacherous obstacle for the heavily armored French cavalry and infantry. For hours, neither side moved. Henry knew he could not wait for the French to starve him out. Around 11 a.m., he delivered the iconic, rousing order, "Banners, advance!" The English army moved forward a few hundred yards and halted. The longbowmen drove 6-foot wooden stakes into the ground, angling them outward, a lethal, improvised barrier against a cavalry charge. The French, insulted by the English advance, finally moved. The first charge came from the French cavalry. They were instantly thrown into chaos. Their horses, panicked by the long, sharp stakes and slowed by the mud, became tangled in their own lines. Then came the second phase, the longbow storm. The English archers unleashed a barrage of arrows so dense and fast that the sky reportedly darkened. These were not bolts designed to pierce the thick armor of the noblemen, but to strike the unprotected horses and the exposed faces, armpits, and leg joints of the charging men-at-arms. The sheer volume of fire was devastating. The leading ranks of French knights, unable to retreat due to the pressure of the thousands behind them, began to pile up in the deep mud. The ground, already churned by the cavalry, became a horrific morass of falling horses, struggling men, and razor-sharp arrows. When the French men-at-arms finally slogged into contact with the English line, they were already exhausted. Their armor, designed for tournament combat, not a slog through thick mud, was a fatal burden. The English men-at-arms, lighter and more mobile, fought with a desperate ferocity. The battle lasted only a few hours. The French forces, riddled by the longbows and suffocated by the narrow, muddy terrain, broke into rout. The noblemen who made it to the English line were quickly overwhelmed. In the midst of the battle, Henry V fought on foot, taking an axe blow to his ceremonial crown. The slaughter was catastrophic. By dusk, over 6,000 French noblemen lay dead, including the Constable of France, 3 dukes, and 90 barons. The English lost fewer than 600 men. The tennis balls had been answered with a deluge of arrows.